Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel, and today we're diving into a story that has been whispered about for years but rarely explained in full detail, a story of secrecy, discipline, and preparation that shaped one of the most mysterious aircraft programs ever discussed, the early training phase behind the F-47 and the hidden groundwork that made it possible. When people hear about advanced fighter programs, they usually focus on the aircraft itself, the technology, the speed, and the combat potential. But what often goes unnoticed is the intense human preparation that happens long before the aircraft ever becomes operational. The early F-47 training program was not just about teaching pilots how to fly a new jet, it was about reshaping how they think, react, and operate in environments that pushed beyond existing combat doctrine. From the very beginning, this program was wrapped in layers of secrecy, with only a select group of personnel even aware that such training was taking place, let alone its true objectives. Candidates were chosen quietly from experienced pilots who had already proven themselves in elite squadrons, but even they were not told exactly what they were being prepared for. Instead, they were informed that they were entering an experimental training pipeline designed to test new methods of aerial combat, decision-making, and endurance under pressure. One of the most striking aspects of the early F-47 training was how much emphasis was placed on mental conditioning rather than just physical flying skills. Pilots were exposed to complex scenarios that required rapid judgment calls with incomplete information, forcing them to rely on intuition sharpened by constant repetition and stress. These exercises were deliberately designed to be disorienting, with changing objectives mid-mission and simulated system failures introduced without warning. The goal was not perfection, but adaptability, training pilots to remain effective even when everything seemed to be going wrong. Unlike traditional training programs, where success is measured by clear metrics, this program often provided no immediate feedback at all. Pilots would complete grueling sessions only to be dismissed without explanation, leaving them to analyze their own performance and question their decisions. This lack of confirmation was intentional, encouraging deep self-reflection and critical thinking rather than reliance on instructors. Another hidden element of the program was the integration of cross-domain training, something that was highly unconventional at the time. Pilots were exposed to simulated cyber threats, electronic warfare environments, and even space-based asset coordination, long before such concepts became mainstream. They were expected to understand not just how to fly, but how their actions fit into a much larger operational picture. This broader perspective was essential for the envisioned role of the F-47, which was meant to operate as part of a highly connected combat network rather than as a standalone platform. Physical endurance also played a major role in the early training phase, but not in the way most people might expect. Instead of focusing solely on strength or reflexes, the program emphasized sustained performance over long periods of cognitive strain. Pilots underwent extended simulation sessions that lasted far longer than typical training sorties, testing their ability to remain focused and effective while fatigued. Sleep deprivation scenarios were carefully controlled and monitored, pushing participants to their limits while collecting data on performance degradation. These experiments were not meant to break pilots, but to understand where the breaking points were and how to train beyond them. Another rarely discussed aspect of the program was the way instructors themselves operated in the shadows. Many of them were not active-duty pilots at the time, but veterans of classified projects whose experiences could not be openly acknowledged. They brought with them lessons learned from past experimental platforms, failures that never made it into public records, and successes that were quietly shelved. Their role was less about teaching specific maneuvers and more about guiding pilots through a mindset shift toward future combat realities. Communication training was also handled in an unusual way, with an emphasis on minimalism and clarity. Pilots were trained to convey complex tactical information using the fewest possible words, reducing the chance of misinterpretation under stress. This was particularly important for operations where data links might be compromised or unreliable, forcing reliance on voice communication alone. The training reinforced the idea that every word spoken in combat has weight, and unnecessary communication can be just as dangerous as silence. One of the most intense phases of the early F-47 training involved adversary simulations that went far beyond standard aggressor tactics. These simulations incorporated unpredictable behavior patterns, mimicking opponents who did not follow established doctrines. Pilots often found themselves facing scenarios where traditional responses failed, forcing them to invent new solutions on the fly. This constant pressure to innovate was exhausting, but it built a level of confidence that could not be achieved through conventional training. The psychological screening process for the program was equally demanding and continuous. Rather than a one-time evaluation, pilots were constantly assessed for stress response, emotional regulation, and resilience. Subtle changes in behavior were noted and analyzed, sometimes leading to quiet removals from the program without explanation. This was not a reflection of weakness, but an acknowledgement that the program demanded a very specific psychological profile. Team dynamics were another critical focus, even though much of the training appeared individual on the surface. Pilots were rotated through different group configurations, forcing them to adapt to new teammates and leadership styles. This prevented the formation of rigid hierarchies and encouraged flexibility in both command and cooperation. The idea was to create pilots who could seamlessly integrate into any unit or mission structure without friction. Technology played a central role in the training, but always as a tool rather than a crutch. Simulators used in the program were far more advanced than anything publicly acknowledged at the time, capable of replicating highly complex environments. However, pilots were often required to complete exercises with limited or degraded system support, reinforcing fundamental skills. This balance ensured that pilots could leverage advanced technology without becoming dependent on it. Perhaps one of the most controversial aspects of the early F-47 training was the intentional ambiguity surrounding the aircraft itself. Pilots were trained using placeholder systems and generic interfaces, with no clear indication of the final platform they would operate. This prevented preconceived notions from influencing their learning process and kept the focus on principles rather than specific hardware. Only much later, in select phases, were hints of the actual aircraft's capabilities gradually introduced. The isolation experienced by participants was another defining feature of the program. They were often separated from their usual units and support networks, operating in small, tightly controlled environments. This isolation fostered a strong sense of self-reliance, but also tested emotional resilience over extended periods. Support was available, but it was subtle and unobtrusive, reinforcing the expectation that pilots manage stress proactively. Ethical decision-making was also woven into the training in ways that were not immediately obvious. Scenarios were designed to present morally complex choices with no clear right answer, forcing pilots to weigh consequences quickly. These exercises acknowledged that future combat environments would present difficult decisions under extreme pressure. The program aimed to prepare pilots not just to act decisively, but to live with the outcomes of those decisions. Over time, the cumulative effect of this training began to show in subtle but powerful ways. Pilots demonstrated faster adaptation to new scenarios, improved situational awareness, and a calmness under pressure that set them apart. Instructors noted that participants began to think several steps ahead, anticipating changes rather than reacting to them. This level of cognitive agility was exactly what the program was designed to cultivate. Despite its intensity, the early F-47 training was not without its critics within the system. Some argued that the secrecy and psychological strain were unnecessary and potentially harmful. Others questioned whether such an elite, narrow pipeline could be scaled effectively for broader force integration. These debates remained largely internal, shielded from public scrutiny by the classified nature of the program. As time went on, elements of the training began to quietly influence other programs. Certain techniques and philosophies were gradually adapted into more conventional training pipelines, stripped of their most extreme aspects. This diffusion of ideas suggested that the early F-47 program was not just about one aircraft, but about redefining how pilots are prepared for future warfare. What makes this story particularly compelling is how little of it has been openly acknowledged. Much of what we know comes from fragmented accounts, declassified snippets, and patterns observed in later training evolutions. The full picture remains incomplete, but the outlines are clear enough to reveal a program unlike any before it. At its core, the early F-47 training was an investment in people rather than machines. It recognized that no matter how advanced technology becomes, the human element remains decisive. By pushing pilots beyond conventional limits, the program sought to create operators capable of thriving in uncertainty. This focus on adaptability, resilience, and judgment may ultimately be its most lasting legacy. As discussions about